In this video, we're going to talk about something that's essential to all your activities in 3D Studio Max, and that's transforms. What that means is moving, rotating, and scaling your objects. And I'm going to throw in copying your objects in here too. That's really important as well. So we'll start with just a standard primitive again, a box. Now, to copy that box, first of all, let me show you where the buttons are. So right here is move, select and move, select and rotate, and select and non-uniform scale. That is, there's 3 different options in scaling. I only ever use this one and this one. This is uniform scale and this is non-uniform scale. Let me show you the difference. We'll start with scale, I guess. Scale. And again, you have your gizmo here. You select here and it scales both directions. Just like that. Actually, it's scaling in all directions. Just like that. Now, actually, with the gizmos on, you can scale non-uniformly without even changing it up there. You can see if you just select on one of the axes of the gizmo and scale in that direction, it's scaling non-uniformly, meaning it scales more in the Z direction than it does in the other directions. And there you can do that with all of them. And really this is going to do the same thing now. If you didn't have your gizmos on, X, then now non-uniform scale along the X-axis, it's highlighted there. And uniform scale, you can see all the axes are highlighted. Okay, but for now we'll just leave our gizmo on. That makes it easier. Rotate. Rotate, you can use your gizmo as well. And as you can see, there's 3 axes here, represented by 3 different colors. The yellow will rotate it around the Z-axis, which is always up in 3D Studio Max. This is rotating it around the X-axis. You can see it highlighted there. And the Y-axis. So now we've gotten a little funky here. Let's go back. Okay, so here in the top view, this will illustrate. So if we want to rotate around the X-axis and put this right up on its side, and you can see that the rotation is the angle of the rotation is showing up right there in that yellow text. Couple other things, we can rotate. We can also right click and bring up our quad menus here and hit on rotate and hit this little box here, and whenever you see a box like that, that means you can bring up options like this. And here you can rotate with a type-in number, so rotate at 90 degrees along the X-axis. Boom, there you go. 90 around the Z. There you go. And of course, move and scale have the same thing. Move. Okay, so all 3 axes are there. When you scale, if it's set up here to uniform scale, then you just have a percentage like that. If it's non-uniform scale, then you have 3 axes and each one can be scaled differently. So if you need exact numbers, you can go there. Another thing to keep in mind is here, angle snap toggle. Here's our snap 2, which we haven't talked about at all yet. But let's talk about this angle snap toggle. So if that's on, when we rotate, the angles are pretty small, but we're actually snapping to certain angles. If you look at the numbers down here, these numbers also show what you're doing as far as transforms go. You'll see that we're going from 90 to 5, 10, so every 5, it's snapping to every 5 degrees only. If you want to go in smaller increments than that, you need to have that turned off. But if you want exact numbers, and you don't have to try and carefully get it right to that exact number, then you can turn on the snap. Or you can always just type it in here too, 95, and you can set exact exact rotation angles. Like right now, this is rotated at the 90 degrees in the Z angle, and it's always going off of how you first created it. So it's 90 degrees from where we first created it. Let's make it 30 degrees, and so that's kind of an absolute number. So that puts it at 30 degrees. The X, we'll put it back to 0, just like we created it. And these are offsets. So it's at 30 degrees right now, but we want to add 5 more degrees to it, just like that. So that offsets it 5 degrees from where it was, so now it's 35 degrees. So that's the difference between these absolute world and the offset world. Okay, and move is pretty self-explanatory. You can move it in any axis, just like this. Only in those 2 axes. Only in these 2 axes. And that's kind of demonstrating how that gizmo works a little bit. Now let's put this back to 0 degrees rotation, so we're straight. Now let's talk about hotkeys real quick. We'll use move, rotate, and scale all the time. And so for me, I set up hotkeys for those. Move is Q, rotate is A, and scale is Z. And you'll notice that that's for your left hand on the keyboard. That's just the furthest to the left you can get with those 3 letters. Very accessible by your left hand that's not on the mouse, so you can hit them very quickly and easily. I would recommend doing something like that that's really easy to hit whenever you want, because you'll use those regularly. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about is copying. All you do for that is move something or rotate it or do any transform on it while holding down Shift. So let's try that. Shift and move along the x-axis, and it brings up these options. So the clone options, it's called cloning. Okay, here I really only ever use the first 2. Copy and instance are the 2 important ones for me. Copy just means that it makes a copy of it. Instance means that those 2 objects are still linked together, and I'll show you how. So if we make this an instance like this, and then we put, say, some sort of modifier on it, we'll show you that FFD modifier again, and you can see that already the FFD showed up on both of these. So essentially anything you do to one instance, it will do to any other objects that are instanced to that same object. So instances remain tied together, and they always do the same thing. You can see that there. Now if those were just copies, that wouldn't happen. I'll demonstrate that real quick. There's actually a button here to break the instance, so that's called Make Unique button. So that is now essentially just a copy of this first box. Now if I do something on it, it's no longer instanced to that other box, and so it will be unique, and this box won't copy what it's doing. It's important to keep your copies and your instances straight, especially when you have, for example, a can light or some sort of light in your architectural project and you have 200 of them. You don't want to go back in and have to adjust each one of those lights individually if you realize they're too dark or too bright. So you make sure the lights are instances, you change it one time if they're all the same kind of light, and it updates all of them. If you have any objects in your scene that are going to be used over and over and over and over again, I would recommend instancing them. If you have something that's similar to something else in your scene, but you're going to want to modify it, then make sure to copy it so that those modifications only happen to your new object and not to the old one. That can screw you up sometimes. So try to keep those straight. It'll speed up your workflow quite a bit if you get good at deciding whether to use copies or instances. One more thing about rotating before we end this video. Let's just show one other important aspect. Okay, so you can see this gizmo is always right here in the center of this box, and that's because that's where the pivot of that box is. And if you go into okay, so there's create, there's modify, and here's hierarchy. And if you hit this button pivot, it shows the pivot of that box. So like, for example, if you rotate that box, it's going to rotate around. Oh, that's funky. Okay, we don't want that on yet. So it's going to rotate around that pivot. Okay, so that pivot, when you created that box, is essentially put right at the center of the box. But you can change that, and I'll show you why you'd want to do that. If you hit this effect pivot only, it shows you the pivot, and then you can move that pivot just like that. So let's just move it down here real quick. Turn off effect pivot only. So now that box is pivoting way down there. So if we go into rotate and rotate it now, it's going to rotate still around that pivot. So say we wanted a bunch of these blocks in a circle, you could do this. Hold down shift, rotate. It's going to rotate around that pivot. And we'll say we want number of copies. Well, we select instance, number of copies, really number of instances here. We'll say 9. And you see what that does. Now we won't go too much in depth right now about this up here, but use pivot point center. So for your transformations, if you want to do what I was just doing, you want to make sure you're on use pivot point center. So that means it's going to rotate around that pivot like I said. You can also change that to let's see. This one is use selection center. So the center of that selection is going to be in the center of that box again. If you selected all these, then it would be rotating around the center of all of them combined. You can see right between those two boxes. And then there's one third one, which is use transform coordinate center. Okay, so to do what I was doing, you want to rotate around the pivot center. Okay, so that's all we got for transforms, copies, and instances.